Soper concluded that science and human life meant nothing to me. Was I a victim or a villain? The Bowens kept me on despite some suspicions being raised. George heard that I was planning on quitting. He panicked, thinking that I shouldn't be roaming free. He ran all the way to the Board of Health and told a doomsday story about the dangerous killer cook spreading germs to everyone she comes by. He completely dehumanized me by calling me a menace to society, a living culture tube, and a chronic typhoid germ producer. He wanted them to take me into custody and force me to give up samples of my feces and blood. He recalled my temper and stature. He said that force would have to be used. The question is raised on how this is a possible violation of my civil rights. You can't just pluck people off the street and demand their body fluids. Could you? The evidence against me was still circumstantial. I had violated no crime. I was a legal law-abiding citizen. The Fourth Amendment of the United States says that a person has the right to be secure in his or her person, house, paper, and effects against any search or seizure. They must have probable cause. A judge must issue a warrant. An individual suspected of a crime has a right to fair treatment, which the Fifth and 14th Amendments protect. The Fifth Amendment states that no person will be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Today, when most people discover they have a deadly disease, they usually comply as most people don't want to hurt anyone. If they don't, public health officials can force that person to undergo an examination and treatment. But they must follow the law regardless. They are supposed to respect your rights. They have to go through the courts. But in 1907 they had a board of medical doctors, legislative and governmental powers. They had absolute power and could create laws, pass the laws it created, and enforce the laws it made. Its regulations on public health matters were final. They had never arrested anyone who appeared healthy though, and I definitely seemed fine. George convinced them that they had the right to take me into custody and that it was their duty. He thought that maybe a woman would be better for the job. He sent over a tiny lady named Dr. Josephine Baker. No one mentioned my temper. She believed she was on a routine call to collect samples. This case was personal to her, as her father had died of typhoid fever, which changed the course of her life. She became one of the few female doctors in New York and dedicated her life to improving the health of the poor. She knew there was a link between poverty and illness. She cared for immigrants, educated people on hygiene, and delivered babies. She stated that it was rough work. She climbed stair after stair, met drunk father after drunk father, bad mother after bad mother, and dying baby after dying baby. Although she seemed nice, she did have a prejudice against Irish immigrants. She claimed they were dirty with no ambition, but I stood before her, my outfit clean and neat as a pin. She called me a self-respecting woman. She told me she came to collect samples. I said no and returned to my work. She returned without anything. Dr. Baker was not one to back down from a fight herself, just like me. She was even known to punch a man who then fell down the stairs after he poured boiling hot water on his pregnant wife. She called for backup. An ambulance and 3 police officers were sent over. She was a match for my temper and determination. I disappeared. They spotted my footprints in the snow, and I had hopped the fence. The servants were questioned, and they denied ever even seeing me. Baker was being heavily pressured by her boss to get these samples or get me to a hospital. She stayed and searched for hours. Just as she was about to give up, she spotted some blue fabric from underneath a few ash cans in the doorway. Under that was a door, and when it was opened, I came charging out like a caged animal. I fought and swore as Baker tried to reason with me while being held by the officers. I kept insisting I didn't have typhoid. They forced me into an ambulance while I was kicking and screaming. It took 4 police officers to lift me into the vehicle. Baker sat on my chest, and she later said the hardest dollars she had ever earned while working for the health department was when she was sent to get me, Mary Mallon. Welcome back. I was taken to a quarantine hospital. I was put into an outside isolation ward. Everything was white. White walls, white ceiling, white bed, white sink, and white toilet. I wore a white bathrobe. It's all I had to wear because my clothing had been confiscated. Just like a prisoner. I wasn't allowed to use the telephone or even write a letter. For someone as fiercely independent as me, this would have been almost too much to bear. I was forced to submit to medical testing with no idea how long I would be here. George Soper said that this was necessary as I was considered a dangerous and unreliable person. Even the tiny doctor woman, Josephine Baker, said that it was my own bad behavior that led to my doom, stating that if I had just given her the samples, they would not have had to take it this far. But how can that be true? What would have happened after the samples came back positive? Then what? Probably the same outcome. I tried to hold off going to the bathroom as long as I could, but I finally couldn't hold it anymore, and they got the samples out of me. My blood was also taken without my consent. The specimens were then analyzed. They found none in my urine, but there was a colony of the deadly typhoid bacilli in my feces. I had rosy cheeks, crisp blue eyes, clear skin, and overall good health, but despite my outward appearance, I was a carrier. I kept claiming I had never had the illness, but obviously I had at some point. Does this make me a liar? Not really. I might have been too young to remember, or my immune system might have been so good that it could have been confused for the flu. In most typhoid cases, about 97%, the typhoid germs win and the victim dies, or the immune system wins and the germs die. But in a small number of cases, the victim recovers but continues to harbor the deadly bacteria for several months. In an even smaller number of cases, the disease results in a draw. Neither wins and the victim carries the germs for life. This happens in about 1% of cases. George Soper was excited about the find, of course. He came in saying that he was going to try to get me out of there. He even offered me a deal to make me a rich woman if I cooperated and I gave him the rights to my story. He said that he would change my name, of course. He said that my hospital stay depended on my behavior. He treated me like a parent talking to a child, saying that it was my fault, but stating that no one wanted to harm me. I later wrote that if no one wanted to harm me, why was I kidnapped and locked in a hospital room with no freedom or dignity? He tried to explain that I didn't wash my hands well enough and I was offended. He stated that we had to remove my gallbladder and that I didn't need it, and that was the only way to get rid of the colony that had formed. Remove my organs? I thought he said no one wanted to harm me. He told me about the people I had spread the illness to, saying that some had died. He tried to reason with me, but instead I glared at him, walked into the bathroom and slammed the door. I was convinced they were trying to kill me. Stories of grave robbers and selling unethically sourced bodies to medical schools was all over. They are found in Irish history and folk history. 2 infamous serial killers were Irish immigrants who sold bodies to the Edinburgh Medical School. Also the famous H.H. Holmes, who created an entire hotel to confuse and kill innocent people. Then sell their remains was definitely a talking point. About 2 weeks after my arrest, my story was leaked to the press. Little boys who sold newspapers screamed on the streets, "Woman is a human typhoid germ." There was something referred to as yellow journalism, where stories get exaggerated because the more sensational, the more frightening, the more distorted the facts, the more papers they sold. They still use this term today. The journalists dehumanized me a great deal. They didn't use my real last name, but they called me an Irish cook named Mary Ilverson and called my body the enemy of mankind. There were no laws protecting my privacy at this time. The health department had never quarantined a healthy person. I had to be guarded 24 hours a day because of my constant attempts to escape. Soon after the story broke, I was shipped off to Riverside Hospital, a facility where escape would be impossible. Without a lawyer, without a court order, without due process. I was placed on an island in the middle of the East River. I boarded a patient steamer boat and made my way, angrily of course. This place held patients that had tuberculosis, diphtheria, typhus, and other horrible contagious illnesses. I later wrote that I was nervous and frustrated. My left eye began to twitch uncontrollably, and I couldn't close it for 6 months. No eye specialist examined me. It could have been stress, but we will never know. I was given a small cottage away from the other patients with modern amenities and a small dog for company. Welcome back to my story. I was put on random medications to see what would happen. Some rougher than others on my body. They weren't sure if these things would work as I became equivalent to a lab rat. Often combining these harsh medicines with colonics. This was all dangerous. Even George Soper acknowledged this. He said, anything that will kill the bacilli apparently will kill the individual. In his view, he was warding off an epidemic. The health department officials scared me. When I came to the department, they said the germs were in my intestinal tract. Later, they said they were in the muscles of my bowels. Then they said to take out the gallbladder. My fears had been realized. They had quarantined me for medical research. Time went on. The sun rose and set every day. Holidays went by. Reporters said that I had spent my time in total isolation, shunned by the nurses and other attendants. They bring food to my door 3 times a day, then flee like they were going to catch something from me. They do not dread leprosy, smallpox, scarlet fever, and a score of other diseases, but they avoided me. This is what the papers said anyway. I did manage to make a friend, a nurse by the name of Adelaide Jane Offspring, and I still got visits from my police officer friend named Brayhoff. I was allowed to have visitors. I tried to keep busy by caring for sick children who no one else wanted to go near. I continued to lobby for my release. I told a reporter that I never had typhoid fever and asked the question of why I should be banished. Forced to live in solitary confinement with only a dog as a companion, they considered releasing me after 10 months, but the health department didn't want it to be their responsibility. A nurse suggested I write to the board saying I had a sister I could go live with in Connecticut, making me another state's problem. But I refused to lie, stating that I had no sister, and the nurse called me a hopeless case. I never said why. I never considered to returning to Ireland. Maybe when I left the situation there was too dire to ever dream of returning. I had been here so long, where would I go there? I had no family left as far as we know. I knew I had the right to stay in America because I was a naturalized citizen. I mentioned to a reporter that I was told to say I was going to leave the state and live under a different name, but I refused, stating that I will either be cleared or die where I am. A year passed. I was still determined to win my whole freedom. I arranged for a private lab to analyze some of my samples, 10 separate times, and they came back negative. This gave me hope, but I had tested positive 8 more times at the hospital where I was. I saw this as a confirmation that I had never had typhoid, and this deepened my mistrust of the New York City Health Department. We don't know why this happened, but there are many possibilities. Tainted samples, inefficiency, not up-to-date facilities, or the fact that I was named an intermittent carrier. They didn't want to release me still, fearful that if someone else died because of me, that it would fall on their heads. They tried to convince me that the best surgeon in town could remove my gallbladder, and then I might be able to be released. I said, "No knife will be put on me. There is nothing the matter with my gallbladder." They couldn't even make up their minds whether I was sick or not. I feared they would give me ether and perform surgery against my will. I was still convinced they were trying to kill me. I was no physician, but surgery was much more risky in 1908. Even today there are serious risks involved with going under the knife. There was a good chance I might have died during an operation or an infection, and as I said before, antibiotics weren't discovered for another 34 years. Even if the organ was removed, it might not have worked because the bacteria can live in other parts of the body like bone marrow. George didn't understand my reluctance, saying that it was just a gallbladder, but it wasn't his gallbladder. He started to become famous, like he wanted. He detailed his work and his discovery of the deadly cook. His work spread into a lot of medical journals. The question during a lecture was raised whether I should be kept locked up. I was not the only healthy carrier in New York. So why was I being held? This is when I was referred to as Typhoid Mary, a term that meant I was a polluted and troublemaking woman, a name you all still hear today. As they collected their rewards, I waited for my release. One unfortunate day, I saw my full name and likeness splashed across 2 pages of the newspaper. I was called Typhoid Mary, most harmless, and yet the most dangerous woman in America. But I will have my day in court. Welcome back to my story. It was estimated that over 800,000 people saw the news article written about me with my full name, the place I was being held, and pictures of me in a paper called The New York American. It had George Soper's paper written about me in it, but they had changed the name of it to The Extraordinary Trail of Death and Disease Left by Mary Mallon. Another doctor gave his 2 cents, stating that they tried to cure me but to no avail, and that it was the health department's duty to safeguard me from the public. He and a reporter agreed that I should be locked up for life. The reporter was more empathetic, stating that I had committed no crimes or even been accused of an immoral act by any judge or court of law. I hated being a freak show. Hospital workers called me the kidnapped woman. I shared my resentment with my situation and said, how would that doctor like if I called his wife by her name, with the word typhoid in front of it, and put them in the paper? One of the readers was a lawyer by the name of George Francis O'Neill. He called my circumstances absurd and a clear violation of my civil rights. He offered to represent me. It is unclear how I paid for his services, or if he offered them for free or not. He intended to give me my day in court. I had my due process rights that are protected in the 5th Amendment. He went straight to the Supreme Court and demanded evidence to be shown why a person is being held. It had been 2 years at this point since I was taken from my place of work. I finally got to go to court, my first time leaving the premises. The reporters were all impressed with how well I looked, despite the story that was being told. Other reporters made me look like a witch in writing, stating I had the power to make others ill. And if you understood the mindset of the public at this time, there were still plenty of people that believed in witches that were out to get you. My lawyer argued that my rights had been violated multiple times at this point. I was relieved to have someone on my side. In court, I claimed that I was innocent, and now I was being treated like I was in a sideshow circus. O'Neill asked the question, how much power should doctors have? This woman has been a victim of unfortunate circumstances, he stated. Thousands of typhoid cases were recorded that same year, and that only 2 cases were linked to me. They had also identified 5 other healthy carriers, but I was the only one locked up. Why was I singled out? They said it was because of my occupation as a cook. They said I was a dangerous person and constant menace to the public health, to be at large. They didn't offer me the opportunity to learn another trade or even to learn how to not infect others. They said they had a right to hold me because of the tests. The negative labs were also presented. But so little was known about bacteria and viruses in the public that the very science of it was also on trial. The health department admitted that it would be too expensive to keep all the healthy carriers isolated. Not everyone believed that I should be locked up. Even other medical professionals said it was unfair. One person offered his hand in marriage and said he would take care of me, but claimed that I should know that he had been insane 3 years earlier. I didn't agree to it. I claimed the health department was just trying to make a show of me and protect the rich. I wrote violently threatening letters to George Soper and Josephine Baker. Dr. Baker said she could understand. Sometime later, a new director, named Mr. Letterly, was put in place and agreed to free me if I promised never to cook for another family again. I agreed, and I even signed a paper swearing to it. I also agreed to regularly check in. He was satisfied with my promise and signature, but no one could convince me I was a typhoid carrier. Latterly said they trained me how to care for myself and actively tried to find work for me. I had no education, skills, or family to take me in. Maybe they let me go because they got what they wanted out of me. I packed up my belongings in 1910, hopped on the steamer boat, and I was free after 3 years. I reported regularly to the health department. I didn't cook for anyone, found work as a laundress, and I didn't kill the doctors I said I would. Being a laundress was physically hard, and at 41 years old, I was getting tired. The average life expectancy for women of this time was under 50. I knew cooks made more money. I asked for $50,000 in a lawsuit for violating my rights, but it got dismissed. I struggled to make ends meet. I couldn't escape the fame. Every time there was an outbreak of typhoid, my name was mentioned over and over again, and was now known throughout the world. I was a private person who resented publicity. It was humiliating. At some point, I stopped reporting to the Board of Health. No one knew where I was or what I was doing. They barely even noticed. Welcome back. Typhoid fever was spreading throughout a maternity hospital in January 1915. 24 cases and 2 people had died. Infants and mothers fell ill. Mostly the sick were the staff. How could this happen here at Sloan Hospital? They had an outstanding reputation. It was neat and clean. It was a model hospital in the teaching of students and surgeons. A typhoid vaccine had been developed in 1911, so a lot of the staff were immune luckily, but it was still an embarrassing event to them. George Soper became involved as they begged him to come, knowing his reputation in epidemiology. The hospital director did mention that they had hired a new cook in 1914. An excellent, sufficient cook who never talked much about herself. They all enjoyed her cooking and desserts. She was reliable, well-liked, and never sick. Her name was Mrs. Brown. The other employees had jokingly nicknamed her Typhoid Mary. George asked to meet her, but mysteriously she had left the building. The director handed over her resume letter to show him, and right away, because of all those threatening letters I had sent him, he recognized my handwriting in a split second. That's right. Here I was again. Dr. Josephine Baker told a different version of an events, giving herself credit for finding me. She claimed to have heard about the outbreak, and when she arrived at the hospital, she said she saw me standing there right before her very eyes. She said I was standing there causing typhoid among adults and children, like a destroying angel. The entire staff was required to give stool samples, and of course mine came back positive, but before action could be taken, I disappeared. I wasn't about to be taken again. But 8 years to the day of my first arrest, a patrolman had reported to see a veiled woman that he recognized as Typhoid Mary from all my pictures in the paper. If you actually read the article, it is greatly sensationalized, stating I was carrying a deadly bowl of Jell-O to my friend's house. The police were vaccinated against typhoid, and they surrounded the house. No one answered, so one officer climbed a ladder and came face to face with 2 dogs, but he had some meat in his pocket, and they took it happily. What great guard dogs they were. It was reported that I was found cowering in the bathroom. At 46 years old, I had no fight left. After 4 years of freedom, I was put back in my bungalow. I received a life sentence. I had said I struggled financially, and with no references and no one wanting to hire Mary Mallon, I changed my name many times and cooked all over the place. A restaurant, a boarding house, even a sanitarium. George Soper said he didn't feel sorry for her anymore. The newspaper said they had captured a modern witch, once again referring to me as evil. George wanted me to get rid of the idea that I was being persecuted, stating that I had abused my privilege and broken my parole. He said that I had endangered almost 300 people in that hospital. Each was angry, saying I never helped anyone except myself. I made a life for myself on the island, my own cottage, a small dog and food, but I was described as a moody, caged jungle cat by the staff. Despite my attitude, they still tried to cure me by injecting me with billions of the typhoid germs, hoping it would help. But I was purely experimental. They finally admitted that removing my gallbladder would not have been beneficial, as it could be spread to other organs and continued to breed. I did make some friends, and was pleasant, as long as no one asked too much about my past, or no doctor was tinkering with me. I read a lot. I especially loved magazines and the work of Charles Dickens. There were other healthy carriers discovered. In 1922, a farmhand had been forbidden from handling food, but he ignored that, and he infected 87 people, which caused 2 deaths. He fled and was found cooking somewhere else and caused 35 more cases, resulting in 3 more deaths. He was released. After only 2 weeks of isolation, in 1928, there was another typhoid carrier placed at Riverside as well, but they were lenient on him because he had children, even though he was identified as a carrier 13 years prior, after his ice cream caused an outbreak, and was permitted to live at home. But he also violated his parole and went back to confectionery. But no one called him names or put his name in the paper. I continued to write threatening letters to the doctors because everyone needs a hobby. I began work as a domestic at the hospital and was given day trips off the island, but always came back. I worked my way up and became a nurse, to a hospital assistant, to a lab assistant. I prepared glass slides, washed bottles, and cleaned. It was said that I wasn't brilliant, but I was concise and efficient. The woman who gave the job became my friend forever. I had to stay at Riverside for 20 years. At the age of 60, I had suffered a stroke and remained bedridden for 6 of those years. I died of pneumonia at 69. Before I died, I had accumulated $4,000, which would have been about $60,000 today. I split all that amongst the few friends I had made. My death was reported widely. 9 people came to my funeral. My life took a turn, all because I never washed my hands. Thank you for listening to my story.